a brief retreat by the Trump administration, as there will be at least a 1-month exemption on tariffs on Canada's auto sector.
Canada's response to the newly elected U.S. President Donald Trump's sweeping tariffs on its auto industry sent shockwaves through the global economic landscape. The world watched in disbelief as Canada, often perceived as the United States' closest ally and most dependable trading partner, took an unprecedented retaliatory stance. The counterstrike was bold, calculated, and aimed at crippling the very core of America's automotive industry. For decades, the two countries had enjoyed a deeply integrated supply chain, where parts and vehicles flowed seamlessly across the border. However, the sudden imposition of tariffs disrupted this harmony, forcing Canada into a position where drastic measures became necessary. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. The automotive sector, a pillar of both economies, faced immediate turmoil. Canadian automakers and suppliers had long been intertwined with their American counterparts, forming a production ecosystem that relied on mutual cooperation. Yet, with the Trump administration's aggressive tariff policies threatening to drive up costs and disrupt operations, Canada found itself backed into a corner. The response was not merely a defensive maneuver, but a strategic economic offensive, designed to inflict maximum damage on the U.S. auto industry. Canada's government swiftly enacted retaliatory tariffs, targeting critical components and raw materials essential for American car production. These countermeasures sent the message that Canada was not willing to be bullied into submission. The implications of this economic warfare were profound. U.S. automakers, already grappling with shifting market dynamics and the rising costs of production, suddenly found themselves facing an existential crisis. Canada supplied essential parts such as aluminum, steel, and specialized electronic components used in vehicle manufacturing. The counter tariffs meant these crucial materials would now be subject to exorbitant price hikes, putting significant financial strain on U.S. car manufacturers. Factories that depended on a seamless supply chain were now forced to either absorb the increased costs or pass them down to consumers, making American-made cars considerably more expensive. This move also exposed the vulnerability of the U.S. auto industry's reliance on cross-border trade. Many consumers and industry experts had long believed that American car companies operated in a self-sufficient bubble, but Canada's swift retaliation shattered that illusion. The tariffs disrupted the just-in-time manufacturing model that had become the industry standard, leading to bottlenecks, production delays, and a scramble to source alternative suppliers. Automakers found themselves in a dire predicament. Either move production out of the U.S. to avoid the tariffs or brace for plummeting sales due to skyrocketing vehicle prices. The impact reverberated beyond automakers and into the broader economy. Dealerships, logistics companies, and even steelworkers in the U.S. felt the sting of Canada's counterstrike. Jobs that had once been stable were suddenly at risk as production slowdowns forced companies to reevaluate their workforce needs. The ripple effect was immediate and severe, threatening thousands of livelihoods. Canada, in a single stroke, had turned what was initially an American trade offensive into an economic self-inflicted wound for the U.S. Canadian officials, defended their response as a necessary measure to protect their economy from devastation. For decades, Canada had been a reliable trade partner, often conceding to U.S. demands in the spirit of maintaining a healthy economic relationship. But the Trump administration's abrupt imposition of tariffs, without negotiation or compromise, left Canada with no choice but to retaliate. By targeting the auto industry, Canada ensured that the pain would be felt where it hurt the most, at the heart of American industrial might. The political ramifications were just as significant as the economic ones. Within the U.S., fierce debates erupted over the wisdom of Trump's tariff strategy. Industry leaders, economists, and even some members of Congress began to question whether the administration's aggressive trade policies were worth the cost. The once thriving auto industry, which had been a symbol of American innovation and industrial dominance, was now facing one of the worst crises in its history. The fear among business leaders was not just about immediate losses, but the long-term consequences of alienating a trusted trade partner. Canadian automakers, meanwhile, were quick to capitalize on the situation. With tariffs making U.S.-produced vehicles more expensive, Canadian manufacturers positioned themselves as the more viable alternative. They ramped up production, sought new global partners, and aggressively marketed their vehicles to international buyers who were now hesitant to invest in American-made cars. The counterstrike was not just about punishing the U.S. auto industry, it was also about securing Canada's position in the global market. The shock of Canada's move extended beyond North America. Other trade partners, including the European Union, Japan, and China, closely monitored the situation, evaluating their own trade strategies with the U.S. If Canada, a nation long known for its diplomatic approach, was willing to engage in economic warfare, it signaled a broader shift in global trade relations. The world no longer viewed the U.S. as an unchallenged economic superpower, but as a nation vulnerable to strategic countermeasures. As tensions mounted, the markets reacted with volatility. Stock prices of major U.S. automakers plummeted, while Canadian companies saw a temporary boost as investors recognized the strategic advantage of their position. The uncertainty surrounding trade policies led to hesitant consumer spending, with potential car buyers delaying purchases amid fears of further economic instability. The Canadian government, despite facing criticism from some quarters, remained steadfast in its decision. Officials argued that a strong response was necessary to deter future economic aggression from the U.S. The message was clear: Canada would not be a passive victim of protectionist policies. Instead, it would leverage its economic strengths to fight back, even if it meant temporarily straining relations with its largest trading partner. The sheer scale of the disruption forced American automakers to rethink their long-term strategies. Some explored shifting production to Canada or other regions to circumvent the tariffs, while others lobbied aggressively for a reversal of the trade policies. The uncertainty left businesses in a precarious position, unable to plan for the future with confidence. The response from labor unions and workers added another layer of complexity to the situation. While some American workers initially supported Trump's tariffs, believing they would protect domestic jobs, the reality proved far different. As layoffs loomed and factory closures became a real possibility, opposition to the administration's policies grew. In Canada, however, the move was met with widespread approval, as workers saw it as a necessary stand to protect their livelihoods. This clash over tariffs did more than just disrupt trade. It altered the perception of North American economic relations. For decades, Canada and the U.S. had been seen as inseparable partners, working together for mutual benefit. But the tariffs and the counterstrike forced a re-evaluation of that relationship.
GDP, and in the wake of Trump's tariff threats, there is a new urgency to deal with them.
It had the leverage, the resources, and the political will to challenge U.S. economic decisions when necessary. The automotive industry, once a symbol of cross-border cooperation, became the battlefield for a much larger economic struggle. The moves made by both nations set the stage for a new era of trade negotiations, one where Canada refused to be sidelined or dictated to by American policy shifts.
America is back. Diplomacy is back at the center of our foreign policy.
The world was watching, and the lesson was clear. Economic power was no longer concentrated in the hands of a single nation. Canada's counterstrike was a wake-up call, not just for the U.S., but for the entire global trade system. The sheer scale and precision of Canada's retaliation left many in shock. For years, the country had built a reputation for diplomacy, compromise, and economic stability. But this moment proved that Canada was capable of playing hardball when its interests were threatened. The swift, calculated nature of the response made it evident that this was not a knee-jerk reaction but a well-planned economic maneuver designed to maximize its impact. As the immediate effects of Canada's counterstrike unfolded, it became clear that the decision had sent a strong message to the global community. No country, no matter how economically dominant, could expect to impose unilateral tariffs without facing repercussions. The landscape of international trade had shifted, and Canada had positioned itself as a force to be reckoned with. While the full impact of these events would take time to manifest, one thing was undeniable: Canada had shocked the world. In a bold strategic move, it had not only defended its economic interests, but also delivered a powerful lesson in economic resilience and retaliation. The consequences of this standoff would shape the future of trade relations for years to come. redefining the balance of power in North America and beyond. The sheer magnitude of Canada's counterstrike against the U.S. auto industry was not just a reaction to the immediate impact of Trump's tariffs. It was a demonstration of strategic economic retaliation at a level few had expected. The move went beyond a tit-for-tat trade war. It was a calculated attempt to disrupt the foundation of the American auto industry in ways that would not only be immediately damaging, but could also have long-term consequences. The extent of Canada's involvement in the global automotive supply chain meant that its actions had ripple effects beyond North America, sending shockwaves through international markets and prompting major economic players to reassess their positions. One of the most immediate consequences was the unprecedented level of supply chain chaos. The North American automotive industry had spent decades refining an ultra-efficient, cost-effective supply chain that depended on seamless trade between Canada, the US, and Mexico. Canadian-made components were not just simple add-ons, they were integral to the assembly of American vehicles, from engines and transmissions to advanced electronic systems. With the sudden imposition of tariffs and retaliatory measures, production timelines became unpredictable, and costs soared as companies struggled to adapt. For manufacturers, this meant a drastic reassessment of their strategies. Car companies that had relied on Canada's robust manufacturing base suddenly found themselves scrambling for alternatives. But shifting suppliers was not a simple process. Many of the parts produced in Canada had been tailored to specific vehicle models, and finding replacement suppliers in the US or overseas was neither quick nor cheap. Production lines slowed, and in some cases, entire plants had to temporarily shut down, leading to mass layoffs and economic uncertainty for thousands of workers. At the corporate level, CEOs and executives of major US automakers were thrust into crisis mode. The unexpected severity of Canada's retaliation forced them to rethink their long-term strategies, with some even contemplating the relocation of their manufacturing operations entirely. Moving production outside of the US was a controversial prospect, especially given the Trump administration's emphasis on America First policies. However, as the financial strain mounted, automakers had to make difficult choices. Maintaining operations in the US under the new tariff structure was unsustainable, and the threat of permanent plant closures loomed large. In Canada, the government's aggressive response was widely praised. Rather than being seen as an overreaction, it was interpreted as a necessary defense of the nation's economic sovereignty. The auto industry was not just a business sector, it was a cornerstone of Canada's economy, employing hundreds of thousands of workers and contributing billions in revenue. The tariffs imposed by the Trump administration had been viewed as an existential threat, and the government's swift and forceful counterstrike reassured Canadians that their interests were being defended at the highest levels. The public reaction in Canada was one of national solidarity. Labor unions, business leaders, and ordinary citizens rallied behind the government's actions, recognizing that economic aggression from the US could not go unanswered. Workers in Ontario, home to the country's largest concentration of auto manufacturing plants, organized demonstrations in support of the countermeasures, emphasizing that Canada's economic stability was at stake. The sense of unity was palpable, with even political opponents of the ruling government acknowledging the necessity of a strong response. Meanwhile, within the United States, divisions began to emerge. While some sectors of the economy had initially supported Trump's protectionist policies, the real-world consequences of the auto tariffs forced many to reconsider. The American automotive industry was deeply embedded in both the national economy and the psyche of the American worker, and the disruptions caused by the trade war put enormous pressure on the administration. The backlash from industry leaders was swift and unrelenting. Executives from major automakers, parts suppliers, and dealership networks took to the media, warning that continued economic warfare with Canada would have disastrous consequences. Even within Trump's political base, support for the tariffs began to erode. Many blue-collar workers who had initially viewed protectionist policies as a way to safeguard American jobs now found themselves facing layoffs and uncertainty. The tariffs had not created new jobs. Instead, they had exacerbated instability in an industry that had already been dealing with global competition and evolving consumer preferences. The growing discontent put pressure on lawmakers, forcing some within Trump's party to openly question the administration's trade strategy. As the situation escalated, the global automotive market reacted with apprehension. International automakers with operations in North America, including European and Japanese manufacturers, expressed deep concern over the growing rift between the US and Canada. Many had established factories and supply chains that relied on the seamless integration of both countries' economies. With tariffs throwing this delicate balance into disarray, companies faced difficult decisions about where to invest in future production. Germany, Japan, and South Korea, all of which had major stakes in North America's auto industry, began to reassess their strategies. Some European automakers, which had previously planned to expand their US manufacturing presence, started considering Canada as a more stable alternative. The move was not just symbolic, it was a clear indication that Trump's aggressive trade policies were driving foreign investment away from the US and into Canada. In response, Canadian officials engaged in active discussions with international partners, positioning their country as the more reliable trade destination in North America. One of the most significant developments was the reaction from China. While already embroiled in its own trade war with the US, China saw Canada's counterstrike as an opportunity. Beijing quickly moved to strengthen trade ties with Canada, extending offers of increased investment in the country's manufacturing sector. Chinese automakers, which had been eyeing entry into the North American market, saw the US-Canada rift as a chance to establish production facilities in Canada and bypass the uncertainty surrounding American trade policies. The involvement of China introduced another layer of complexity to the situation. While Canada remained cautious about becoming too dependent on Chinese investment, the potential economic benefits were undeniable. If major Chinese automakers established a foothold in Canada, it would not only provide a much-needed boost to the country's economy, but also further isolate the US from global trade networks. The Trump administration, which had sought to contain China's economic influence, found itself inadvertently pushing Canada into closer cooperation with Beijing. Meanwhile, the stock markets remained in turmoil. Investors, already wary of the ongoing trade wars, reacted with volatility as the automotive sector faced its biggest crisis in decades. The stocks of major US automakers plummeted, wiping out billions in market value. Investors who had previously bet on the resurgence of American manufacturing under Trump's leadership now found themselves scrambling for safer options. Many turned to Canadian firms whose newfound strategic position in the global market made them attractive investment targets. Beyond the immediate economic consequences, the geopolitical ramifications of Canada's counterstrike were profound. Traditionally seen as a stable and cooperative ally, Canada's aggressive response signaled a shift in its approach to international trade. The country was no longer content to be seen as the junior partner in North America. It had demonstrated that it was willing to leverage its economic power when necessary. This newfound assertiveness was closely watched by other US allies, many of whom were also facing trade disputes with the Trump administration. Countries within the European Union, for example, began reassessing their own trade strategies with the US. If Canada could push back against Trump's tariffs and disrupt a major sector of the American economy, other nations could potentially do the same. The growing resistance to US trade policies suggested that a new era of economic alliances was emerging, one in which nations were no longer willing to passively accept protectionist measures without retaliating. As the trade war between the US and Canada intensified, the question of how far each side was willing to go became increasingly urgent. Canada had proven that it was willing to escalate the economic conflict, but the long-term consequences remained uncertain. Would the US double down on its tariffs and risk further economic instability, or would it be forced to reconsider its approach? The world watched anxiously as the standoff unfolded, knowing that the outcome would shape the future of North American trade relations for years to come. Regardless of what came next, one thing was clear: Canada had fundamentally changed the game. What had started as a unilateral move by the Trump administration had spiraled into a full-scale economic battle with global implications. Canada's counterstrike was not just about protecting its auto industry, it was about asserting its place in the world economy and demonstrating that even the most powerful nations could not act with impunity. The shock of Canada's response had sent a message loud and clear: economic aggression would not go unchallenged, and the consequences of such policies would be felt far beyond their intended targets. The world had just witnessed an economic counterstrike of historic proportions. and the aftershocks would be felt for years to come. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on Canada's counterstrike against US auto tariffs? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.